Glasgow, my hometown. I've lived here most of my life, but it still has the power to surprise me.
Wow, the scale of it. This is quite breathtaking.
Open a door, walk down the street. This is an incredible city. And one man did more than anyone else to transform this Victorian powerhouse into a new kind of metropolis.
Born 200 years ago, Alexander Thomson created a bold, monumental style that defined Glasgow's most ambitious age and helped turn it into the second city of the empire.
Thomson designed every kind of building the booming industrial city demanded. Tenements and churches, shops and galleries, grand terraces and suburban villas. In this film, I'm going to meet the people who live in and love Thomson's creations.
Every time you walk into a room, it strikes you new, just how lovely it is.
And the fans dedicated to saving his legacy.
I got that out the skip and took it home in the back of a 59 bus.
I'm going to discover how a man who never left these shores fell in love with different worlds.
If you look at a Bible of the period, you'll see, well, a picture like this, with architecture as its star feature.
And how his unique designs anticipated our own cityscape.
He created his own extraordinary style of architecture, rooted in the past, but yet something new.
The name Charles Rennie Mackintosh is known around the world, but I believe that Alexander Thomson was perhaps an even greater visionary. He was more than just an architect. He was an artist, and his blazing imagination was fired by the past, embraced the present, and looked to the future.
Wow, this is going to be a treat.
Edinburgh, the self-styled Athens of the North, an Enlightenment city that rebuilt itself in the image of ancient Greece. And overlooking everything, the National Monument, a copy of that ultimate icon of the classical world, the Parthenon. Construction began in 1826, but only 3 years later, funds ran out and the site was abandoned.
Edinburgh may have fallen out of love with the classical world. But 40 miles to the west, it was a different story. The new powerhouse of Glasgow would take ancient Greek ideas and ideals and forge an architecture fit for a new industrial world.
Even before work had begun on the National Monument, Glasgow had overtaken Edinburgh as the biggest city in Scotland. Over the decades that followed, it exploded. Its industrial pioneers and immigrant workforce creating a dynamic city that could boast some of the finest buildings anywhere in Britain.
This is Great Western Terrace on the west end of Glasgow. It was completed in 1877, 2 years after the death of Alexander Thomson. But to my mind, this final masterpiece is as impressive as anything you can find in Edinburgh's New Town or Bath's Regency Crescents.
Colin McCluskey lives on Great Western Terrace.
David.
And he's showing me one of the homes which has been recently restored to match Thomson's original vision.
This is quite breathtaking. God, the sheer scale of the interior. This is quite ravishing. You would never imagine looking at the simplicity and the linear nature of outside that this the treasure trove that's about to be discovered. Beautiful stuff. Colin, who could afford to live here back in the day?
Tobacco magnates. J.W. McGregor lived here first. Blackie, the publisher, lived in the terrace, and William Burrell moved in 1902.
What makes Thomson so special?
I moved here about 27 years ago, and I would never move. A lot of the people in the terrace have been here longer than I have and would never move. Once you live in the building, you become part of the building.
With Great Western Terrace, Thomson managed to match the monumental symmetries of classical Athens with the ever-expanding ambitions of the second city of the empire. But the man who became known as Greek Thomson began his career in a very different place and a very different style. As industrial Glasgow boomed, its wealthier residents looked for a haven from the crowded streets and polluted air. Thomson, who suffered from asthma, longed for an escape too. Sea air and salvation came down the Clyde in newly fashionable villages like Cove and Kilcreggan. And Thomson, now an up-and-coming architect, was happy to design houses in whatever style his clients wanted, including a clan chieftain's lair at Craigrowney Castle. I'm meeting its current owner, Deli Onaya.
Deli.
Hi, David. Hi, how are you?
Lovely to meet you,
Hi,
Deli.
welcome. Please come in.
Thank you. Thank you.
There we go. Right, David, this is the drawing room.
Well, it's certainly not what I expected from a Thomson interior. Very different in style. So, Deli, what's the history of this extraordinary building?
Well, yeah, the house was built for John McElroy, who was a well-known Glasgow iron and steel and railway merchant. It was obviously commissioned through Greek Thomson, McElroy and Thomson and their partners developed this whole area, Kilcreggan and Cove, which are like twin villages, as a speculative venture, building basically weekend and holiday homes for wealthy Glasgow merchants and wealthy Glasgow families.
This was built as a weekend home. Good Lord. You've got to be joking. It's a castle.
Maybe if I can show you around a bit more, show you some of the other rooms and let you see the different styles. This is the music room.
The music room. Deli, there's a complete contrast to the drawing room we've just been in.
Yeah.
Chalk from cheese.
Yep.
So what is it like as a family home?
It's just a fantastic place to live. It looks kind of imposing and magnificent, and it is, but there's a warmth and an intimacy about it that we've been able to share with other people since we've been here that we really, really appreciated.
When it was built in 1854, Craigrowney was the height of architectural fashion. Its romantic fantasy of turrets and battlements was repeated on an even grander scale at Balmoral and dozens of other Scots baronial piles up and down the land. Thomson loved a monumental sense of scale. He loved rooting buildings on the landscape. Craigrowney, behind me, which seems to grow out of the rock itself, is a prime example. But he had less time for misty medieval nostalgia. No, he wanted to look back deeper in time to something more elemental, something that would connect him to the eternal itself. Alexander Thomson's love affair with ancient worlds began early. One of 20 children, he was born in 1817 in a small cottage in the Stirlingshire village of Balfron. His staunchly Presbyterian father was bookkeeper at the local cotton mill and oversaw his family's education. It was an upbringing steeped in the vivid language and imagery of the Old Testament. Sandy Stoddart is one of the country's foremost sculptors. He understands just how profoundly the Bible moulded the imagination of Victorian prodigies like Thomson.
If you look at a Bible of the period, you'll see that it's going to be peppered with engravings of the Holy Land, all the mud huts, tremendous things to terrify children. I was one of them. And then you find, well, a picture like this, with architecture as its star feature. This is Belshazzar's Feast by John Martin. He is the king of the vast. And what we see here is an insistence on the power of the horizontal. The endless procedure into the distant horizon, the vanishing point, has a power to make one think of the pathos of distance, the far away, not only geographically distant, but also distant in time. Now, this is something that would have entered into the young Thomson's mind when he's looking at illustrations like this and knowing about this culture at the time.
Pathos was never far from Thomson's life. By the time he was a teenager, both his father and mother were dead. But his talents won him an apprenticeship at a Glasgow architectural firm. Here he was enthralled by classical mouldings and architectural fragments collected from abroad.
The Bible, Babylon, Israel and Egypt, ancient ruins. All these things were bubbling away in Thomson's fervent imagination. And when he eventually realised those visions in stone, he created some of the most exotic and beautiful buildings ever seen in Britain.
Caledonia Road Church in the Gorbals. The dramatic ruin dominates the city skyline, and a landmark of another kind too. Built in 1856, this is when Thomson became Greek. Before the Caledonia Road Church, Thomson had designed in an eclectic mix of styles. But now, in a new partnership with his brother George, he would begin his lifelong and very personal exploration of classical architecture. Sally White from the Alexander Thomson Society knows and loves this building well.
Sally, in the 1970s, I spent 10 years in the Gorbals, the Citizens Theatre, 150 yards from here. And this building, this tower, is emblazoned in my memory. Yes. It's so iconic. So tell me about it.
Well, I think it's a stunning piece of architecture. Even as a ruin, it's a stunning piece of architecture. It was described by the American historian Henry Russell Hitchcock as one of the finest, if not the finest, classical romantic church in Europe.
Was he unique in that period of designing in this style?
Yes, I think he was. I think that many people, many architects have used classical architecture and its principles and produced beautiful buildings. But Thomson didn't recreate them. He understood the language, he understood the complex geometries, he understood the kind of mystical qualities of it, and he then interpreted that in a very individual and unique way. So I think that's the difference.
Alexander Thomson was the last great architect of the Greek Revival. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, the first archaeological surveys of Greece inspired a new classical building style. In countries such as England, Germany, and the United States, Greek Revival architecture became a statement of civic virtue, rationality, and democracy. But in Scotland there was another influence: the intense debates and upheavals of the Presbyterian movement.
Presbyterianism in 19th century Scotland was the idea of the Old Testament over the New. The New Testament was thought to be irredeemably Romanized, whereas the Old Testament was more primitive, less corrupted. Now, architecturally speaking, this meant Greek, because Greek architecture is unto Western architecture as the Old Testament is unto Scripture.
The purer form.
The purer, the originating form. And of course, there's an extension here because having gone to the original Greek form, they even go further than that. Thomson actually goes as far as Egypt.
As ancient Egypt,
And
yes.
of course, that's Israel in Egypt, you see, and the Presbyterians regard themselves as the new Israelites. So that's why Thomson has this vast backward-looking skill.